Over in the WWE, Thurman Sparky Plug, of course, the NASCAR driver turned wrestler, is making his WWE debut. Owen Hart stepping out of his brother's shadows finally and turning on him during a tag team match. The Undertaker is sealed in a casket by Yokozuna and ascends to heaven. But over in World Championship Wrestling, my guest today is taking over the reins and about to embark on a year of power moves that really set the stage for much of what's come to be talked about on various streaming networks and whatnot as a war and all this conjecture that gets thrown in. But 1994, safe to say, the year that the seeds were planted?
First of all, thank you.
Oh, thank you for being here. Yeah, sorry.
Being here, Sean.
You jumped right in.
No, it's 93 was really probably the most tumultuous year and exciting year in some ways because it precipitated a lot of the changes that allowed me to take advantage of a situation or be propelled into it. 94 was definitely a big year for us for a lot of different reasons, but it was exciting. It was the beginning of a very, very important era in my life and in some ways within the industry.
Let's start with your role at the beginning of the year. Your ascension to executive vice president happens prior to 94, but get us up to speed and talk about that move.
Yeah, and you know, Sean, so much of that stuff happened so quickly and there was so much going on around it. So if I make a mistake, forgive me.
You're off the hook.
All right. But I will say that I was made executive producer either in 93 or 94, and then shortly after that, vice president, and then shortly after that, executive vice president. So where those titles kind of fell into the timeline, I'm not really sure. But it was about 94 when I went from being more or less in charge of the television product to becoming more active in the overall business of WCW and probably taking a little bit more of a participatory role in the live event side of things, the talent side of things, as well as to a certain degree the creative side of things, which hadn't happened before.
What is Ted Turner's role as you become vice president? How hands-on is he? Is this something where you're talking to him once a week?
No, you know, and I think there's a big misconception about that, you know, within the wrestling community because people think that, you know, and part of it is precipitated by the narrative that has come out of WWE for so long, and especially during that time when we were really, not during that time, but like 95, 96, 97. But the narrative out of WWE is that, oh, Ted Turner just wanted to, you know, kick Vince McMahon's ass, and it was a Vince McMahon-Ted Turner war. It really wasn't. I'm sure that made Vince feel better while he was getting his ass kicked to say that it was Ted Turner doing it and not some guy that had just auditioned for him with a broom 4 years earlier. I get it, but it wasn't Ted. Ted was a little busy doing a lot of other really big things at that time. You know, wrestling was important to Ted, and I heard that. I knew that kind of anecdotally through the people that I reported to who reported to Ted, but I had very little contact with Ted Turner.
Okay.
I just knew that he was there and he was supportive.
Who is booking when you first take the reins?
Even that's somewhat hard to remember because there were so many transitions, you know, when you say booking or, you know, I refer to it as writing or being a showrunner, but the booker at that time, I think when I took over in 93, was really, you know, I came in kind of after the Bill Watts debacle. So Ole Anderson was kind of involved at the time. I think Dusty Rhodes may or may not have been involved at the time. But when I first more or less took over as executive producer, took over television as executive producer, I had nothing to do with booking. Nothing. In fact, I couldn't get far enough away from it, to be honest with you. I didn't want to become involved with it. But after I immersed myself more and was, I don't want to say forced into it, but I saw that if I didn't take a little bit of control over it, then I wasn't going to be able to control anything. I put Dusty into that position. I believe initially, Dusty was my choice. So I had a great relationship with Dusty.
When you first get the title, What's the company's financial situation? Are you made aware of that, even though you just run television?
Yeah. No. When Bill Shaw said, look, again, going back to the Bill Watts disaster, so many things went so wrong. And it wasn't just Bill Watts. I mean, prior to Bill Watts, things had, Kip Fry was a disaster, and Jim Herd was a disaster. And, there had been a series of disasters along the way. But Bill Watts took it to a whole new level with the nature of some of the things that he did. But the end result, when I took over the company, I remember specifically, it was a company that was grossing, but I mean, all revenue in was $23 million a year, and it was losing $10 million a year in the process. That was the financial status of that company when Bill Shaw said, hey, you be my executive producer. And that was just fine for me.
You didn't feel like you were being walked onto the Titanic at all?
No, I was too young, too naive, too excited. My eyes were too big, and so were my balls. So it didn't really scare me. Right now, like yeah, it would now, because now I know what I didn't know then. Right. And that time, again, it's a hard one. That's a hard question to answer at that time. If everything were the same, absolutely, I'd do that again 10 times a month. But yeah, it was an exciting time, and I was excited to do it.
What's the morale like backstage? Do you walk into a divided locker room, a depressed locker room?
I walked into a locker room that was, it's hard to, you don't want to generalize because not everybody was the same, but I think the general feeling was this is just a big payday, and once they sign you up, you can retire here. I remember Larry Zbyszko. Larry Zbyszko, and I worked together at AWA. Larry was one of the first interviews that I ever did in the industry. And Larry came to WCW before I did. And one of the very first things that Larry Zbyszko said to me, and he was one of the very first people to approach me once I showed up on location to shoot a show. He said, Eric, once you sign the dotted line here, you get a paycheck for life. Just keep your head down. That was kind of the prevailing vibe, if you will, there. It was so big, it was so out of control and loose that everybody knew this. Term money.
Right.
You get a gig here, you got a gig for life.
How important an addition is he?
At the time I hired him, I didn't know. I didn't know Zane. I had never really talked to Zane or worked with Zane prior to that. I was relying on input from other people. I knew that we needed a great promoter. I knew that we didn't have anybody in-house. And we had talked to a couple other promoters that none of them really made any sense to me, or none of them made me feel like it was a good choice, I should say. But Zane came highly recommended, and we made that decision.
What would his duties be? I mean, back in the day when you were fragmented into territories, a local promoter promoted his town, but now you're a national company, national TV. Mm-hmm. What's a promoter's job for WCW at that time?
He was boots on the ground. So if we're going to put on a show, and I'll use Denver, that's where Zane lived. But in the case of Denver, Zane knew the building. He knew the building managers. He knew the security staff. He knew, whatever regulatory or licensing people needed to be dealt with. He was on a first name basis with them. He knew the local radio stations. He knew where he could get the best deals. He knew who listened to what, radio stations and read what newspapers. So we knew where to put our advertising. He was really the heart and soul of the promotion at that level. We funded it, obviously, but being in Atlanta and not knowing the market, you can't, it's a little easier now with technology being what it is. But back then, if you didn't live in the market and have direct relationships with those people, you didn't really know if you were buying the right ad or buying the right radio station. And that's what Zane's job was.
He's a hire from WWEF. We're 2 years away from what's come to be called the Monday Night Wars. How competitive are you at this point with what's going on the other channel?
None. I wasn't competitive at all. My only goal when I took over, when I say took over the company, but when I was handed when I was given the responsibility as executive producer and then as vice president, executive vice president, and so on, my only mission was to turn the first dollar of profit that company had ever turned in the history of that division. Ted bought the company from the Crockett's in 88 or 89, whatever it was, and since the minute he had purchased it, it had been losing money hand over fist. When you add to the fact that not only had it been losing money hand over fist, it became kind of an embarrassment under the Bill Watts regime for a lot of reasons that everybody probably knows about. And it was critical. And I was told by Bill Shaw, the gentleman that hired me, say, Eric, this is the last shot we have at this. If we don't turn this company around and make it something that's viable for the Turner portfolio, this company is going to go away. And by viable, it meant stay out of the headlines, don't do any stupid shit, and turn a profit, because the company never had. So my goal was just to make $1. That's all I wanted to do.
You know, this is one of those kind of lost WCW footnotes. Talk about
for a good reason.
Yeah, well, talk about some last-ditch efforts to save Fred Ottman from himself.
Yeah, I honestly, I wish I could remember more about that, because people keep bringing it up, and I feel guilty about not having more recall. But that was not my idea. Not that I'm more than willing to accept my responsibility for a lot of bad ideas, because I have a lot of them I can take credit for. But that particular one wasn't mine. And I'm not really sure I can remember why we were trying to resurrect him, other than it was hugely embarrassing. He was a great guy.
He's a good guy.
And everybody felt for him and wanted to try to make it right.
What's your perspective on the oft-discussed altercation?
You know, I remember it. I haven't thought about it a lot, but I remember it when it happened. I was sitting. I wasn't on the European tour where it happened. I was sitting at home with my wife and my kids, and I got a phone call, late one morning, like 2 or 3 in the morning, telling me what had happened, and it was a little surreal. I couldn't imagine it. And on one hand, I couldn't imagine it, but on the other, I could. It was uncomfortable because I wasn't there, and I wasn't able to control anything, and I was relying on input from people who were pretty upset, some of whom had seen it, some of whom were in the hospital, some of whom were dealing with local police, and the information I was getting was pretty sketchy. So my reaction to it at that moment was a little frazzled as a result. Afterwards, I was just disappointed, because I understood it. I'd been around situations like that, my entire life, but in the wrestling business. And I know how it would have or could have happened, and I was, more than anything, I was disappointed and embarrassed for everybody.
How persona non grata is Sid stemming from this? Is there any consideration of bringing him back to 94?
No. He could not have buried himself in a deeper hole, just from a liability perspective as a company, from a public relations perspective. It didn't make any sense to bring him back at that time.
Was there a final straw in removing Dusty and wanting to go with a committee?
I don't remember the details, but clearly you've done your research, and if Bill Shaw was on that committee, and I remember vaguely that he was, it would have been probably his desire to have a committee, which is a typical kind of a corporate structure kind of thing to do.
Did you feel it was wrong instinctively?
No, because I didn't have enough of a feel for booking and creative at that time to know whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. I kind of, look, I still love to this day, my partner Jason Hervey and I, we have a team of great people in Los Angeles, and one of the things that I love about being in the entertainment business is getting in a room with a bunch of people and just riff at ideas. Because ideas, it's hard to, people say, who came up with that idea? In interviews like this in particular. But the genealogy of an idea usually is a result of 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 more people, pitching in and taking a kernel of an idea and then growing it or shaping it. And I liked that process, but at the end of the day, when it comes to the wrestling business, you've got to have somebody that says, or is willing to stand up and say, no, we're going to do this, and here's why, and have everybody fall in line. If you have a committee of people where everybody feels like they have an equal voice and nobody is willing or able to step up and say, okay, let's move on. We're going to make this decision now. Let's go to the next challenge. It ends up just being muck. You know, there's a saying in life that a camel is a horse created by committee. And I've experienced that. So I probably liked it in the beginning because it's my nature to riff and vibe with a group of people. But I'm sure that I got frustrated with the lack of decisiveness.
Because you could maybe kind of have it as long as there was a Lorne Michaels to say, you know, Chevy's bit, Gilda's bit, John's bit. That's what goes this week.
Yeah, but there wasn't. You know, what you had was a bunch of people,
Right.
some of whom were very political. You know, some of whom were kind of jockeying for position. Some of whom were just saying, oh, this Bischoff kid's going to, you know, go up in flames in another 6 months and somebody else will come in, because that had been the pattern. You had Eric Bischoff, who was sitting there as the executive producer or vice president or whatever the hell my title was, who didn't have the experience or the strength of experience to be that Lorne Michaels or be that guy that said, okay, we're going to do this. I just didn't have that at that time. It took me a while to get there. So it was oftentimes a camel that was created by committee.
I'm going to steal that. Is it wrong to say that Ric Flair becomes a de facto head booker of the committee or decision maker of some kind?
No, that would be wrong because it wasn't de facto. It was intentional.
Okay.
I brought Rick in, you know, when Dusty, and Dusty got stressed. Dusty still is to this day, and I haven't talked to Dusty in years, but to this day, you know, I love the experience I had with Dusty and respect Dusty immensely. And I think to this day still is one of the most creative people I've ever met in this business. The problem with Dusty is he, at that time at least, I don't know what he's like now, but at the time he wanted to keep that all to himself. And he can't really work that way. And I couldn't let him work that way based on what I wanted to achieve. So I think the stress got to Dusty and it got to me and my relationship with Dusty. We remained friends, don't get me wrong. There was no animus between us. But it was obvious that we had to make a change. I brought Ric Flair in intentionally because at that time, from my point of view, Rick had a lot of respect from the guys. And that was the thing that we didn't have, because we didn't have that Lorne Michaels or that Vince McMahon or that one guy that sat at the head of the table, and when he said, run that way, everybody went, okay, I may not want to run that way, but I'm going to run that way as fast as I can. We didn't have that guy. And I was trying to find it. It wasn't me, because I was new on the job. It wasn't Dusty. And I thought Rick could possibly be that guy. He had the experience. He was obviously a great talent. And he had a great relationship with a lot of that talent. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
How important is it for you to have Bobby Heenan aboard, and how do you go about making it happen?
You know, how important was it? It was an important piece of the overall puzzle. The overall puzzle was I wanted to take WCW from being a small, regional, southern NWA perceived territory. I wanted to have a bigger, more mainstream national feel. I wanted to attract national advertisers. I wanted television stations in the syndication community, when syndication was still a really, really important part of our business. I wanted them to perceive our business differently than they perceived it as WCW. That was my primary goal, and Bobby was important to that. And I knew Bobby from Minneapolis. You know, that's the other part of this. And a lot of the, you know, changes that I made is I went with what I knew, just like coaches do, and you know, musicians often do, and directors and producers do. They go back to people they've worked with in the past or respect from their past. And Bobby was, you know, I came up in Minneapolis as a young man, a teenager, you know, watching Vern Gagne, and Bobby was like, Bobby Heenan. So when we had the chance to get him, I jumped at it.
The Southern, getting away from the Southern identity thing you said, Is that something you could verbalize down there, or was that
Oh,
a
I
bit
did.
of heresy? No, you didn't.
No, I did. Which is probably one of the, well, there's a lot of reasons I started out with as much heat as I did. One is I deserved it. I was young. I didn't really have any experience, really. I mean, I did. I started out in 1987. I came up in the wrestling industry through syndication sales. I learned production by staying after I was done doing all my sales work and making all my calls and being on the road. I would come in and I would stay late at night on my own time, not getting paid for it, and just learn how to edit or learn how to dub tapes because I was fascinated by it. I just didn't know how it worked. I wanted to know. So I did that, and then I ran camera, and then I did interviews, and then I promoted house shows. So I was like a jack of all trades. I was a master of none of them, but I was able to, because of the situation, expose myself to almost every internal aspect of the business, of the wrestling business, so that when it came time to make a change in the industry, from my perspective, what was most important is that we emerged from being perceived as a small regional wrestling company to being something more mainstream and more palatable for people like M&M Mars and GM and Coors Light and mainstream advertisers. Because that's what was really hurting us. We couldn't get national advertising.
There's wisdom in it. I just wondered if you were able to say that at a table in
I
Turner's
did.
headquarters.
I did. It got me a lot of heat.
Yeah.
Got me a lot of heat. I was the kid from Minneapolis that never laced up a damn boot in his life, and all of a sudden now I'm kind of taking. I didn't mean it to be. Didn't want anybody to take it personally, but I'm taking shots at people that were from the South, and that didn't go over all that well.
You'd recently hired Gene. Now here comes Bobby, and Hogan's coming later. Is there a master plan brewing now for you that you're going to cherry pick from?
It wasn't that master plan. The idea was never to cherry pick, and again, that's part of the narrative now that's been out there for so long. It's in some cases it's fact in the minds of those who just weren't around at the time or looked under the hood enough. But the idea was never to pick cherry pick anybody from WWF. Those people came to me in those cases. I didn't go to them. I didn't sit in a room and go, okay, who can I take from WWE? That never happened. It was more along the lines of I was conducting my business and all of a sudden I would get a phone call from, insert name here or insert name here's agent. And it was like, hey, would you be interested in talking to whomever? Bobby Heenan. I didn't go out and pursue Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan came to me. I didn't pursue Randy Savage. Randy Savage came to me. I probably pursued Hulk Hogan because we were kind of in the same area at the same time. But there was never this master plan to sit back and pick WWE apart.
When Bobby comes in, does he speak of a favorable relationship with WWE, or was it a tenuous one for him?
From what I recall, Bobby was a class act. He didn't come, even the way that he went out the door, which I know bothered Bobby a lot when they kicked him out the door and he had a bunch of women's underwear in his bag and all that. I think that was a little humiliating for Bobby. I don't think he really liked it. I certainly don't want to speak for Bobby. He may feel differently about it than I recall. But my impression, at least at the time, was that it stung a little bit, but he never really had a bad thing to say about WWE. Okay.
What was he like during his time there? Is he someone you'd call a good employee? Easy to deal with?
Wrestlers aren't. First of all, they've never been anybody's employees. They've always been a unique breed of people. They're when I say, I'm not talking about a class of relationship here, but as independent contractors, they're very independent. They're a little bit like gypsies, and especially again going back to the mid '90s. WCW is probably the last remnant of the regional territories. A lot of the people that were very important within WCW had come out of those regional territories. The company hadn't morphed into the corporate kind of animal that it became in the late 90s, and certainly not what WWE has become. So there was a lot of that independent territory mentality that still existed, and Michael was one of the guys who was probably at the center of that. So was he a good person? Was he Was he a good person to have around and work with? In many respects, yes. Michael had a great mind. Michael was a really smart guy, very creative guy. But to me, going back to the Southern thing, that whole Freebird, overweight Freebird gimmick was tired and old in 1994. It was tired and old and kind of dated. So I can't remember if he quit or if I let him go, but if I offered him $75,000, it was probably my polite way of saying you're fired.
Right, yeah. You're one of the first guys I talked to that I can ask about this that might have an answer for me. You mentioned he's nobody's employee, and you're right. How do offices of wrestling companies now, when workers are precluded from going elsewhere, taking jobs elsewhere, taking a picture for somebody outside of the control of that entity that cuts their 1099, how can they still consider them an independent contractor? If they don't have the freedoms that a traditional independent contractor would have, if I hire you as a plumber to come over, I can't tell you can't go to the house down the street after you finish me. Mm-hmm. How are we still getting away with this in 2015? When's this going to stop?
Yeah. Number one, hopefully it won't. I don't think it's as, people want to say it's a bad situation, that, there should be all kinds of benefits and there should be insurance, and that's an ideal world. And maybe it could work. But if you go, I think the IRS, you can Google IRS and independent contractor, thresholds and requirements, and there's a list of 15 or 20 or more things that you have to check off your list in order to be considered an independent contractor. And when you look at that long laundry list of criteria, I don't know the answer to that question.
I have, and the onus is more on a company proving someone isn't an employee from that list than there is in saying someone is a 1099 contractor. And I wasn't even going to the benefits thing. I'm just thinking from a corporate structure, how has it evaded being, I know lawsuits were brought in the past. I think the statute of limitations ran out on Raven and his cruise thing. But it's always confounded me because it's one of the clearest examples. You can't work for WCW if you work here, wherever here might be in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And that, by definition, is an employee.
Yeah, and then when you go even further and start mandating that people adhere to a specific schedule or adhere to certain behaviors or adhere to this or adhere to that, the more control you have over someone, the less likely you will be able to justify your position vis-a-vis being an independent contractor. So, I'm certainly not an employment attorney, nor do I want to be one, but it's a tricky thing, and I think WWE is WWE. For someone to come along and sue and challenge that in court, you've got to be really, really well funded and well prepared, and have a good case, and that's hard to do.
Talk about the Nasties for a minute. Them
do we have to?
Working for you.
Really? Do we have to? I say that lovingly. I love those guys a lot. Still to this day, we're close.
The lawsuit actually that Bobby Walker eventually files against WCW in 2000 states that his Caucasian opponents were instructed to make him look bad and that he was told he would never hold a championship belt. He stated he was paid less than many of the company's Caucasian wrestlers because he was African American and made to look loud, obnoxious, pompous, and shiftless. End quote.
That describes 90% of the people that have ever worked in a wrestling business.
Irrespective of color.
Come on. I made an entire freaking career out of doing that.
Ron Simmons was never shiftless, was he?
No. The fact that Bobby Walker filed this suit, and I've got nothing against Bobby, but the fact that Bobby Walker filed this suit, 4, 5, 6 years after the fact, when Turner was completely upside down and everybody was rushing for the free, lawsuit payday. Right.
First of all, I want to take Disney. Talk to me about the process and the philosophy about shooting there.
It was necessary. If you go back and look at 92, look at WCW television product 92, 92, 93, 94, before Disney. It was horrible. It was horrible. Center Stage, you've referred to a couple times. It was a theater in the round facility that held maybe 450 people. We had been producing shows there for so long, every Monday, basically, giving tickets away, papering the house, that the only people that would come to that event were people that got free tickets, and half of them would show up with a bag of wine and fall asleep halfway through the show. And you probably would get an average of 15 teeth per set, you know, if you counted them on average in the audience. It was just a horror, you know, nothing against the people that came, but your audience is a big part of your show. And I've always believed this, that the audience is the third character in the ring. I mean, you have the good guy, the bad guy, and then you've got the audience. And the referee fits in there a little bit. If your audience isn't the audience you need for that show, I don't care who the two participants are in the ring. It doesn't matter, because the people at home are going to look at it and go, oh, why am I watching this? I kind of feel like I need a shower just because I'm interested. That's what we had. We would go to Georgia, the Georgia Mountain Center in Cartersville, wherever the hell it was, Gainesville. We'd go all around Atlanta, and you could get 250, 300 people to show up. You'd turn the lights down so dark so nobody would see that there was nobody there, and those that were sleeping. It was horrible. So Disney was born out of necessity. I had to figure out a way that we could shoot our show, lighten it up, brighten it up, and give it that mainstream feel. And most importantly, I knew at that time that for WCW to emerge from being considered to be that distant number 2 Southern regional promotion, if we could co-brand ourselves with Mickey Mouse and Disney, and at the very head of our show, it would be coming to you from the Disney MGM studios with a big flyover of the soundstage, the perception of our industry towards us would be dramatically different.
I'd imagine also that the amenities for the boys increased too, being
Not really.
On the studio lot. No?
Not really.
No?
I mean, in some respects, yes, but in some respects, no. There was no strip bars right down the street. That
Well,
they could go
ample
to after the
dressing,
show.
ample dressing room
Yeah,
space.
but there really wasn't.
Food.
You know, the food was better, of course. You know, we took care of them, but it was tough. You know, you refer to it as marathon tapings, and they were. Guys would show up, and they were used to, again, put yourself in the boots of a wrestler or a performer. You know, it's like get in your car with your buddies, drive to the town, show up, do your work. By 10 o'clock at night, you're going to the next town with a couple beers in your lap. It doesn't suck.
Right.
It's hard, but when you're 25, 28 years old, it's not the worst thing in the world. Then you show up at Disney MGM, you've got to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're starting interviews at 11, and you're shooting shows till 8 or 10 o'clock at night. It's a little, you're having 4 matches in a day. It's a little different.
Pretend we have a truth meter here, and I want you to tell me where this stuff lands from 0 to 10. Problems in Disney shooting in front of tourists because of disinterested fans?
It was a big problem.
Okay.
Sure.
So that ranks high on the meter.
Yeah,
Something that was
one of the-
concerning you. Yeah.
Well, we knew it going in, though. We knew the audience we were going to get. We knew they would look good. We knew they could go, yay, boo, whenever we asked them to, because that's what soundstage audiences do. But there's a big difference between that and people who know the characters, know the stories, and are emotionally invested. The emotional investment is what we did not have at MGM.
Right.
But we didn't have it center stage either.
Right, because they were
Because they were
falling
drunk.
asleep without teeth. What about because you have to shoot so much product in such a concentrated amount of time, you're giving away stuff that they shouldn't see. Was that a problem?
No, well, maybe it was. I've not thought about it in that regard, but what we did going in, knowing the challenge, I mean, there were a lot of challenges, but knowing the pay-per-view, everything that we were doing was driving towards a pay-per-view. So you had to be very careful about what you exposed and what elements of a story you exposed, because you didn't want to give away too much that mitigated the pay-per-view or the need to buy the pay-per-view. So it was a constant balancing act, but it was difficult.
Did you reveal less on those tapings because of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. What's the relevance of the weekly taping at this point? I mean, pretty soon we're going to have everybody's going live, but it's also not the syndication days where they're bicycling the tapes. Did you still see having product on at a certain time on a certain channel every week as really the linchpin to the company?
We did. Even when we were doing Disney MGM, we were still doing center stage.
Mm-hmm.
So syndication, Disney MGM was for the most part in the beginning our syndicated product, and we were still doing our key driver, which is TBS, over in center stage. I was just trying to reduce the amount of pressure that our syndication schedule put on our arena schedule, because we were not only doing center stage, we were going to the Georgia Mountain Center and traveling around, the Southeast to produce our syndicated shows, and that's what I was trying to eliminate.
What happened with Missy Hyatt being fired?
There were a couple issues, but the one for me, I'll only speak for the one that I remember vividly, is we were at Disney MGM. I had just hired Sherry Martel, and Missy pitched a fit. She was loud, she was out of control. She was saying things in front of people that was just inappropriate. And it was Missy Hyatt, for crying out loud. It's not like it was Hulk Hogan or Ric Flair or Roddy Piper. It was Missy Hyatt. And I just said, that's just enough. I'm done with this. It was just too much maintenance. Didn't really bring anything to the equation. She was kind of a leftover from eras or creative prior to me. Just kind of there, and then when she turned to what she turned into, I just said, "See ya." Mm-hmm. So the rest of that was kind of her reaction to getting canned. But
blessing in disguise. She'd not have had her acting career had you not done that.
The world would have been starved from the opportunity to enjoy the amazing talent that is Missy Hyatt.
You remember how he comes to you? Is he just one of the guys that gets brought in every once in a while for a tryout?
I wasn't bringing people in. I wasn't active in recruiting talent at the time, so I'm not sure who found him and who brought him in. I would guess that it would have been Terry Taylor or Mike Graham or somebody along those lines had seen his tapes or became aware of him. The only thing I remember about, and actually the only reason I remember it is because I read an interview where he brought it up and it rung a bell, is he lived in the Northeast, and despite the narrative that's out there about ATM Eric and all the money I was throwing at everybody, and the carte blanche I had from Ted Turner because he was sitting back there just waiting for the WWE to fail or fall, none of the above is true. When Paul came to WCW, it was at a time when I was making people count how many pencils they had in their desk. We were crushing the budget. We were just cutting costs everywhere we could possibly cut costs, including travel, which was one of the biggest, darkest, deepest holes in WCW financially at that time. And I said, man, what did I call him? He's a GUD. Geographically undesirable is how I referred to him. And I did it jokingly. It's like, dude, if you want to come in and try out, I'd love to have you, but you got to pay your own way. I can't afford to bring you in. Even if we hired you, we can't afford to fly back and forth. At that time, we were so focused on cutting costs that the only talent we were going to keep on staff were people that lived within a 150-mile radius. So if you lived in Georgia, if you live in the Southeast, Florida, great. But if we had to fly you in from Spokane or New York, probably wasn't going to happen.
Where was the most fat right now in that budget when you were trimming? Was it travel?
It's yes. Travel was a big part of it. Travel was a big part of it because it was managed horribly and because there were a lot of guys taking advantage of the poor management. This, again, going back to the days before e-tickets, this is when I would call up as a talent before I became executive producer. I'm living in Minneapolis. They'd fly me in to do voiceovers for 2 days a week or every other week. I'd call up, I'd say, okay, I'm supposed to come in on Sunday night, I'll leave Wednesday. They would send me a ticket, a hard ticket. Now, if something were to happen, if Jim Ross were to have called me and said, Eric, never mind, we don't need you Monday, we need you to come in Wednesday, I would call up and say, okay, they changed my schedule, I need to come in Wednesday. They would send me another ticket. Now, an honest person, bring that ticket with them, turn it in, because those tickets were good as cash. And Eric Bischoff could have taken that ticket that I didn't use, held onto it, and decided when I wanted to go to Hawaii, just use this for credit. That's the way it worked back then.
Interesting.
And I literally had someone who will remain unnamed at this point, because he's still fairly high profile, come up to me, who was in talent, come up to me and show me a stack of tickets that thick and said, this is where the money is. So that's the first thing I attacked when I was in control.
Wow. How do you stifle it? Do you just telling people turn in your tickets?
No,
that you're
I
not
called everybody out on it. I called the travel department out on it. And look, the talent took advantage of something that they took advantage of. It's human nature, unfortunately. But the real flaw was in the system. The real flaw was in the person in the travel department that allowed that to happen. Right. So that's what I didn't try to attack the culture. I tried to attack the system.
But let's talk about Wildcat Willie, because that's really what's important here. The acrobatic mascot, Gary Hedrick.
Sounds familiar.
Okay, he entertains the crowd between matches, gives away merch. Are we just kind of continuing the kind of the Disney vibe, mascot?
You know that was really a Bob. And by the way, I think it was a good idea. So okay. I'm not trying to fade that heat. If I would have been faced with that, somebody would have come to me and said, "Do you think this is a good idea?" Back then, I would have said yes. If someone were to come to me in a similar situation now and said, "Hey, we have an idea. How about this?" I probably would still give it a whirl. NFL does it. NBA does it. Cheerleaders and, somebody to go out there and entertain the people in between breaks during 3-minute, commercial breaks when the audience is sitting there on their hands. You don't want them to get up and go get something to drink. You want to hold them in their seats. So you need somebody to entertain the crowd when there's not a match going on. But it was Bob Dew, because he worked at the Omni. He oversaw the Omni for Turner Broadcasting at that time, I believe. He was the one that brought the Wildcat Willie idea to the table. And look, it may not have worked, but it was the rationale was a good idea. Let's
talk about the redesign. Who comes up with this? Is there a design firm that you hire? Is this something that's pitched to go look with a futuristic look?
We sat down with the team being Craig Leathers, probably Keith Mitchell at that time, a group of people who were in our production staff. And we said, okay, look, we've got to hit the refresh button. Our graphics are old and tired. The lighting is old and tired. We need to make the show look a little fresher. Again, if we want advertisers to look at us as something other than a small soundstage wrestling company, and we want to attract more advertisers that are willing to spend more money, we have to be worth it. We have to look like the kind of product they want to be associated with. So we had to update every aspect of our show. Graphics and opens and music are the easy things to fix. The environment of Center Stage, not so much. We didn't own that stage. I don't know where the information came from about the $400,000. May be accurate, may not be. But we weren't really able to do much to the soundstage itself because we didn't own it.
But there were, the entrances were augmented now?
Yeah, but that's this styrofoam and a couple gallons of paint. Kevin became part of the booking process because I think it was Dusty. It was either Dusty or Rick, but I'm pretty sure now it was Dusty, believed that Kevin Sullivan was particularly good at getting heat. That was his forte. Couldn't get over a babyface, didn't know how to build a babyface character, but really understood how to get heat, which is an art within an art. Wrestling is an art in my opinion, but getting heat is the art of the art within the art. And Kevin was good at that. And that's how he was recommended, and that's probably why he was brought in.
How does he jive with Flair?
Pretty good. Kevin was a good politician, didn't threaten Rick, supported Rick in many ways. And look, Kevin was an asset back then. He was good at what he did.
They do the brother gimmick with Dave Sullivan and Evad. And is that Kevin's brainchild?
I don't remember who came. It's like I said before, ideas are generally,
Right.
if you try to track down the genealogy of the idea, it's a little frustrating, but probably so. It was the kind of story that I think
Sounds like a Sullivan.
Kevin would have liked.
You remember your reaction when you heard about this?
Yeah, I was pissed off. Because Mick was doing things that I was trying to get him to stop doing. Part of the issues that I had to deal with in overcoming from Bill Watts when I took over at that stage was the number of lawsuits that we were hit with. Litigation was a big concern. And again, Turner, as a company, not as an individual, but as a company, probably as an individual too, just every time there was a lawsuit, especially if it went public and it was something that people just shake their head and go, oh my gosh, not again. So I was trying to avoid those situations, but Mick was determined to wrestle a style that put him at risk, put us at risk, potentially put fans at risk, and that became kind of an issue between us. So when he did whatever he did and he ripped off his ear, and I'm not suggesting that it was his fault necessarily, but it was like just one more Mick Foley thing. Why can't we just work a match? Why do we have to be jumping off balconies and landing on tables on fire and just have a freaking match, for crying out loud?
Let me talk about Germany for a minute. Is there a kind of an international strategy you have in mind here?
Yeah, it was to make as much money as we could wherever we could.
Novel?
We could draw in Germany, particularly when we got Hogan on board. We had a promoter that kind of was very interested in WCW at the time. We had decent TV at the time, and quite frankly, we were able to make money overseas touring that we couldn't make in the United States.
Were drugs in general, not just steroids, a problem in ECW at this time?
You said ECW, and
I'm sorry, WCW.
WCW.
We all know they were a problem in ECW.
Look, I think they were probably yes. Not going to bullshit. They were probably a problem everywhere. The entertainment industry as a whole, wrestling is no different than the music business or actors or anybody else. Athletes. Back in those days, before testing was as exact of a science as it is now. Yes, it was a problem. It's the way people entertain themselves while they're on the road 200 days a year, 300 days a year.
Is wrestling held to an unfair standard? I've never been asked to pee in a cup by Paramount or any company I've ever worked for, and as far as I know, it doesn't happen at the talent level for any production company. Why is it expected to happen in wrestling? Is it sports? Is it entertainment? Where are we on this issue?
It's a really interesting question, and probably worth a show or two of its own. But, when you think about it, wrestling is no different than Breaking Bad. Are those actors subjected to drug tests? They're performers. They're artists. They're independent contractors. They're not handling heavy equipment. They're not flying airplanes. They're not putting public safety at risk. So therefore, why the hyper-focus, and I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be, by the way, but just from a theoretical point of view, why the focus on one particular form of entertainment? Because it is high profile, no doubt about it. There were horrible, sad things that have happened as a result of drugs and drug abuse. But the same things happen in the music business every day.
Say Chris Farley, you can go... Why is it held to a
Because
standard?
I think wrestling for so long tried so hard to convince everybody that they were athletes. And for some bizarro reason, most of it financial, a a lot of states required that wrestling operate under athletic licenses, and then
Right.
once you became, kind of a ward of that state, then you had to adhere to all of the things that went along with that. So it's just a certain amount of, in my opinion, control, and some of that, the wrestling industry brought upon itself by creating the perception that it was a sport.
Can you imagine what we would have as a society missed out on if record labels began drug testing from the 50s?
From the 50s, my
Through-
ass,
through
from
that.
like last week.
From the 50s up through today.
I mean,
The art that would have been lost. April 17th.
we would have never heard of Snoop Dogg.
No, well, that's where
My
I was
life
going.
would be less
The
as
hell
a
with
result.
Hendrix.
No, I'm sure a group of us or a group of others sat in a room. I'll throw myself in that room. I'm sure a group of us sat in a room and laid the whole thing out and went, wow, that'll be really good. People will get off on that. And, anybody that's ever been afraid to admit to being a part of a bad idea has never really been in the business of creating good ideas. So I'll take responsibility for that one. It was a convoluted, screwed up finish that was desired to get a rating 4 days later.
Well, 4 days later, it draws a disappointing 2.4 against a 3.5 for Yokozuna versus Earthquake in a sumo match, for fuck's sake. Are you frustrated when something like that happens?
No.
I mean, this is before you overtake Vince.
No, because at that time I didn't compare myself to Vince. Our 2.4 for us, it was probably a little bit of a disappointment, but TBS never really got huge numbers, and we certainly never compared ourselves to WWE at that time. It was just like apples and oranges.
How does she come into the company? Is she someone that calls you?
She didn't call me because I wasn't really hiring people at that time. So I would have had to approve it, obviously, but she came in probably through Rick. She had a good relationship with Rick. She either came in through Rick or Mike Graham or Terry Taylor or any number of people that were kind of out feeling, the talent situation.
What did you think of her work as a manager?
I love Sherry. She was a riot to be around. She was committed. She was tough as nails. I had met Sherry in AWA, so I had known of her, before then. So she was right up there. I liked Sherry a lot.
It's revived the following year when you can put Hogan on the cover. Is it considered a big loss to the company? Is it an expense that maybe you're happy to have off the top line?
I wanted it off the books.
Yeah.
The magazine was never really a successful, ancillary part of our revenue model. It was there. Everybody kept trying. We kept trying to do third-party deals and doing deals with other people in publishing to get it off the ground, but it never worked. So to me, it was just like, good riddance.
Right.
I'm pretty sure the only reason it came back is somebody came back with a third party attached to it that helped make it make sense.
So you were carrying the entire cost for publishing the magazine. This wasn't somebody else licensing WCW and your talent. You guys were producing the magazine here. Yeah.
In the beginning, and then I believe I could be way off because it just wasn't something I paid a lot of attention to. But when it went away because it wasn't viable any longer. There was no hopes of it being viable, and I didn't want to keep losing money on it. When it came back, the only reason I would have brought it back is if there was a reason to.
Right.
Meaning somebody else was taking
the risk.
Responsibility.
Sure. Getting the real Guardian Angels involved and being able to use the trademark and whatnot, is that something you're involved in?
Yes.
In pitching? Is it as simple as going to them and saying, hey, listen, we have this idea. Why don't you come on and make him a Guardian Angel?
Yes. I reached out to Curtis Sliwa, and I don't remember the conversation in detail, but I remember reaching out to him because I saw a lot of Curtis and the Guardian Angels. At that time, they were kind of active in New York City and prominent. There was a lot of news stories about him, and the whole vibe on the Guardian Angels was pretty positive, but still had a street edge to it, and I thought it would be a good association. It would help get a little bit of mainstream attention. So yeah, I reached out to Curtis and
He was receptive.
flew into Atlanta. We talked through it, and yeah, he was.
Were there things that you'd be allowed to do and not, like could a guardian angel get beaten in the ring on television?
I don't recall that there was that conversation with Curtis. I don't recall him being too adverse to storylines. He was probably a little sensitive to the types of things that the guardian angels would do on camera, so that they didn't put the angels in a bad light,
Right.
Publicly. But winning and losing and getting beat, not getting beat, I don't think was part of it. I had known Paul for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I knew him. Paul worked in the AWA when I worked in the AWA. So I had known Paul a long time prior to that. Don't recall the details of it. Might have just been a talent trade kind of thing. Or
What I have here is that it was a talent trade in exchange for some promotion for your upcoming pay-per-view in Philly. Wanted them to help promote your Slamboree pay-per-view. Something that could have happened?
Sounds like it could have happened,
Okay.
yeah.
What did you think of ECW back then?
I didn't think about it much. I didn't, and I don't mean that to be derisive, but I didn't watch it. I wasn't familiar with it. I obviously had heard about it, was aware of it, but I wasn't really even peripherally focusing on it. It was just there.
Did you like Paul?
I've always, then, like him, probably. I wouldn't say I liked him, but I didn't dislike him. I knew him. I knew that he had certain skill sets, but I wasn't close enough to him to either like him or dislike him. I didn't really trust him, but that has nothing to do with people I like or dislike. There are people that I like that I don't trust. There are people that I dislike that I do trust. So it wasn't that. But in Paul's case, I didn't really trust him. Kind of a trust and verify kind of thing. But I didn't really like him or dislike him. I didn't know him well enough.
Were you ever on the downside of a deal with him?
On the downside of a deal?
Well, he ever screw you over in any way? And after that, when you worked together?
Look, there were times throughout WCW, and that's what you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
WCW, ECW existence. Sure, there were times, as things progress over the course of a year or two, when I'd hear Paul saying things that I knew just weren't true, and I knew why he was saying them, and I knew what his motivation was, but it made it more clear to me that my instincts were correct and that he couldn't be trusted. But I was never, did he cost me money? No. Did he take anything out of my wallet? Nope. Did he steal anything out of my house? Nope.
It's notable to me that you're smiling now because we have a series timeline for ECW also, and all of the talent that we have talked to for every year of ECW's existence has in some way been fucked by Paul, and they all tell the story with a smile and laughing like he's the lovable clown prince with one hand in their pocket fleecing them as he... it's almost comical to be fleeced by Paul Heyman. He's like a lovable villain.
I had dinner with someone last week. Again, I don't want to involve people in things like this that don't volunteer for it, so I'm going to keep the name to myself. But it is one of the highest profile names in the industry in the last 10 years or 20 years, who knew Paul really well. And we had a conversation about Paul. And it's the same thing that you just described. Everybody knew that, the check's in the mail. I gave the money to your mother. Or, I had the money in my trunk and I got rear-ended by a semi and it's blowing around in the wind. But Paul's passion, I think, made up for it.
Okay.
Paul's passion and in many cases, I think the opportunities that he gave people to do things they would have otherwise never had a chance to do, and in some cases move on to WWE. A lot of those ECW guys were able to transition out of ECW into much higher profile and ones where they made money because of the opportunities that Paul gave them. So I think over time, people forgive. Time heals all wounds. So people are able to laugh about the time they got screwed out of $2,000 as opposed to wanting to pull out an eyeball.
Right. In 1979, you would have been hung out a window maybe for things like that if you were a promoter, and people laugh about it. Just find it noteworthy.
It is a unique characteristic. I wish I could master that art form.
Yeah.
I've never been able to screw somebody out of money.
Nobody has ever talked to us in this series
and have him put me
laughed.
over. And say, oh, he's a great guy. He's a genius too. Really?
Is that what his firing was about? Cost cutting?
It was cost cutting. Again, he was geographically undesirable. Okay. He was a Gud. He lived in Minneapolis. And he, God, I try so hard not to say things like this because it's just, at this stage of my life, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or bury anybody, but I just never thought much of him. He's a good looking guy. He was in great shape, but there was something about him.
Didn't have the passion?
He was a dick. I just didn't like him.
Right.
And arrogant, you know, like a lot of people thought he was better than he really was, thought he should have been up here, you know, thought Vince McMahon screwed him. You see people that walk around with a chip on their shoulder all the time, and even if you want to like him, that chip gets in the way a lot. Tom was one of those guys, and he really wasn't that great of a performer, aside from the look. Skill-wise, his ability to relate to the audience, get the audience to relate to him, he was a 5 on a scale of 10, and at that point, it just wasn't worth the hassle.
Very good. Am I wrong in thinking that maybe, I know you're trying to cut budgets and you want to have a profitable year, but at this point, May 16th, are we trying to free up some money for Hulk?
No.
No.
Had nothing to do with anything. It's another of the, or one more chapter in the narrative that is created.
Well,
that, you know, people that want to bury Hulk Hogan back then
Hmm?
was like, oh, I'm suffering so he can bring in this washed-up, has-been, bald-headed guy from WWF. It's not true.
Okay.
Hogan's money had nothing to do with our budget. It was on top of.
I got you.
It was a very unique situation. I had, first of all, Rick's not here to defend himself, Rick Rude. So I'm not going to talk too much about Rick Rude or his frame of mind or what he was thinking because I just don't think that's fair. My perspective was, and I had known Rick for a long time. I knew Rick in high school. Rick was from Minneapolis. Right. Rick hung out with some of the same guys I hung out with. I watched Rick Rude beat guys' asses in bars before I was legal to drink. So I'd known Rick for a long time. Once Rick made up his mind that he was pissed off at you, it took a long time to get over that. And Rude was really pissed off at Ric Flair. I had to get that title back. Ric Flair wouldn't talk to Rick, wouldn't go near Rick Rude. And I remember calling Rick up, because I didn't have any heat with Rick. He was mad at Flair. He wasn't mad at me, really. But probably he was mad at me a little bit for putting Rick in that position, but that wasn't where the direct heat was. So I remember calling up Rick. I said, Rick, I got to get the title back. I couldn't send Ming to go do it. I said, I'm going to have to bite this bullet, and whatever happens, happens. And Rick was a scary dude when he was in that frame of mind. But I met Rick, and he opened up the trunk of his car, and there was a pistol sitting in his trunk next to the belt. I thought, oh, this is just silly. I didn't think it was silly at the time.
Not at the time.
I thought, this is really bullshit. What the fuck is he going to do? He's not going to shoot me, but he's just going to intimidate me. And he reached in and he handed me the belt. And there was no big deal. But there was a lot of heat between Rude and Flair, a lot.
Okay. Did Rick Rude sue the company at some point around here? It's reported that he filed a $630,000 lawsuit against them stemming from his departure and the injury.
I don't recall that. I knew there was a lot of, Rick had a Lloyd's of London policy, so there were a lot of complex issues surrounding that Lloyd's of London policy. God, that had to be pretty.
Oh boy, you had Dave the Hammer Schultz of the Flyers there, for fuck's sake. This is a real wild and maybe the wildest and craziest match in WCW up to this point in this era. Does the fact that it's in Philly and the home of ECW influence that kind of booking at all, do you think?
It probably did, and that sounds like a lot of a Kevin Sullivan thing. I didn't have, I didn't have the vibe on Philly and the nature of the audience and, what they liked and didn't like nearly as much at that time as Sullivan did. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with it, a ton.
In the weeks following this, and on the heels of some other similar matches, there seems to be a shift in the philosophy on blood and violent matches in the company. There's a bit of a fear of national and congressional mood against violence on television. So is this something you guys have a discussion about creatively?
Sure.
And are there rules handed down, or are you just telling the bookers?
No, and actually it probably came more from corporate at some point. Remember, Turner Broadcasting at that time, still is, was driven by ad sales. Well, just ad sales and subscription. And ad sales had a lot to say about a lot of the things that we did. And when blood became an issue for the advertising community, when advertisers on Madison Avenue went, I wouldn't buy any time in your show, look at this. Look what you guys do. You're going to react to that.
Right.
Somebody's going to react to it, and it's going to roll down to us. And it did.
What do those guys think about what's going on? Is there that kind of talk backstage, or are they just happy to be there? Or
I didn't get a chance, obviously, to talk to a lot of them. Larry Hennig I knew from Minneapolis.
Right, sure.
I'd hunted with Larry or been a part of a group. With Larry
I think Vern
before.
was there too.
Vern was there, and obviously I was very close to Vern, very close to Greg. Mad Dog Vachon was there. There was a lot of them or some of them, I should say, that I knew fairly well. A couple of them I was close to. But the subject of what they thought about everything really never came up, at least to me. Maybe I'm sure it did amongst themselves, but not to me.
The show's in Philly. It features current ECW star Funk. The crowd chants ECW, we want blood. Is the decision made to have an extended run for him? I mean, he quits on September 26th via fax, is the report I have. But did you have long-term plans for Terry?
No.
So it was designed to be this?
He was never, he was an in and out kind of an opportunity.
Right.
No one ever planned or had a goal for Terry Funk to be a long-term part of our plan.
And perhaps, again, talking about Philly, talking about ECW, probably part of the
opportunistic,
filling the house. Yeah. How seriously did you guys approach the Hall of Fame idea? Was there ever a pitch to get a physical building somewhere? Or?
Brother, we were trying to make that first dollar in profit. So the Hall of Fame, the idea of it thematically was a great idea, to have one pay-per-view a year that kind of focused on, much like WrestleMania does now with the Hall of Fame, but to have one event per year that focused on the legends and nostalgia was the goal. I don't think anybody really thought too much beyond that with regards to building an actual hall or having a physical representation of it. No.
Which is probably why it's gone after 1995's inductions. Is that something, again, that you thought was not the direction you wanted to head? In keeping with the identity of the company you wanted to build in?
No, I don't know that it was so much of a branding or strategic idea. I think it was probably more of a practical situation for us. Where do we find these legends? How many? It's like one thing to induct 25 people into the Hall of Fame one year. Okay, maybe 2 years. But for WCW, who only had a history that was about 7 years old at that time, where do you find the people that go in that Hall of Fame? The company didn't exist before 1989. This is 1994.
Right.
So
Well, I guess you could have connected to the lineage of the NWA. I mean, that was clearly the logic in having.
You could have, but some of those
Mr.
people
Wrestling
didn't. But there were politics involved in that. Some people wanted to become involved. Some people didn't. It just wasn't as viable to us at that time as one would think. It was harder to make it. I hate to use this analogy, but you know, how do you piss higher this week than you did last week? And then when you roll out everything you've got year one, and then you look at the list of people that you're going to bring back year two, and it's all of a sudden like, and you're going to expect people to get excited about this?
He's not wrestling yet. Why isn't he wrestling?
Don't recall.
Maybe tied into a WWE contract, maybe hurt, something like that.
No, I mean, we'd be speculating, but if he was tied to a WWE contract, we wouldn't have been able to show him on TV at all.
On TV at all.
Yeah.
All right, even in a bodyguard role or something like that, yeah. A better bodyguard to have than Meng? None exists, right?
You know,
From what we hear.
I've heard all the stories. I've never, you know, to me, he was just always a gentle, polite, respectful soul. Thank goodness. I've heard all the stories, but I've never had the occasion to see anything that would make me as fearful of him as I probably should be.
What was Regal like back in '94? What'd you think of him as a wrestler and a champion?
I liked him a lot. I liked him as a person. I liked him as a performer. I liked the way his mind worked. He was, you know, he came from a different school, came from a different way of thinking about wrestling. And it's one that I won't say gravitated towards it, but I probably gravitated a little bit towards it.
Explain it.
I love psychology. I love the art of wrestling. I love the psychology of wrestling. To me, a wrestling match is dialogue. It's physical dialogue, but it's dialogue. And great dialogue, whether it's in a movie or a play, if it's in a book, you know, if it's a written word, great story to me is everything. And Steven Regal brought a different psychology and storytelling technique to the product, and I appreciated it. So I was fond of Steve.
He had a good year in '94. He never really gets into the main event tier there. Was something missing from having him be marketable enough to be top of the card? Was it someone in creative that felt the style was an ill fit?
You know, I can't put my finger on it, but with all, and I mean all due respect to Steve, he never really reached that level in WWE either. And sometimes, not everybody does. You know, I was watching I was listening to an interview on PBS about a week ago from a bass guitarist who's one of the most famous bass guitarists in the music industry, who has toured with Eric Clapton. He worked with Jimi Hendrix. He's still busy to this day performing on records and in concert, touring with all of the top artists in the world. He's worked with more top artists than anybody in the history of rock and roll. And I can't remember his name.
Right.
But none of those artists would go on tour without that particular bass player. There are people in this industry, and I think Steven Regal is one of them, who are just as important to the end product as maybe the guy at the top of the card, or maybe maybe he's putting over the guy he's working with. But if you don't have the Steven Regals of the world to bring it all together and really create the story and make it believable, it's just not. Not everybody's a front man. And I don't think Steven Regal at that time had the work, he had the psychology. In many ways he had the look, but he didn't have the body. Steve was soft. He wasn't a weightlifter. He wasn't one of those guys. And at that time, there was still kind of what makes a wrestler look. Steve didn't really have that. But more than that, he didn't have that mic skill. He couldn't project. He couldn't convince people. He could convince the guy in the ring he was the real deal. And he could make that guy that he was working with look like the real deal. but he couldn't talk to the audience in a way that the audience put him up on a pedestal. And it's that intangible it factor that people talk about. And Steve didn't have that at that time. He developed it in WWE in later years. He became very, very good. In my opinion, one of the better talkers, because I just like his psychology. But he didn't have it then.
Your personal creative style as a writer, not what should be the proper percentages, but for you, place 2 percentages for me on in-ring, physicality, and mic skills, talking, being convincing, looking someone in the eye and telling the truth, as Cagney said.
It's hard to say that. I would say it's probably 55-45.
Which
meaning
way?
You have to be good on the mic. Right. Because if you're good enough on the mic, you could create enough emotion, either way, as a heel or a baby face. You could create enough, as a heel, and I can say this from personal experience, I couldn't work a lick at all. Couldn't even try to pretend I could. But I could make people want to see me get my ass kicked. So while I won't allow anybody to even refer to me as a former wrestler. I'll correct them, even to this day, because it's disrespectful to wrestlers. But I could get people who want to kill me. I could get people who want to spend money to see somebody else do it. So I believe that somebody that's really good enough on the mic can mitigate what they may not have in the ring, but someone who's great in the ring can't create the emotion.
Gotcha. This is Zbyszko's return to the ring. What brings this about?
Oh, probably a little bit of Larry, a little bit of me. Larry wanted to be active. He wanted to be in the ring. It was about the time when I started getting a little bit more involved in creative. I liked, again, it's my personal taste at the time. Larry had that kind of ground and pound, basic wrestling style, and he was a great talker. Mm-hmm. He was a great talker. Tended to say the same things over and over and over again, but he was great at it. But his in-ring work was believable to me, and I liked that balance. I've always looked at wrestling as a buffet. You've got to have some decent seafood over here. You've got to have some prime rib over here. You've got to have some great vegetables over here. You got to have a little bit of everything for everybody. You got to have a great dessert area. Larry was that meat and potatoes section of the buffet plate or the buffet dinner, and I liked it.
Take me through the whole Hogan story. When does this idea bubble to the surface?
Well, if he signed in June, it probably was April, March or April. Might have occurred, more than likely it started at a Disney taping a couple months prior to that.
Was he down there doing Thunder in Paradise?
Yeah, he was doing Thunder in Paradise. We were shooting a show. And I don't remember who the liaison was. Somebody said to Hulk, hey, Eric Bischoff would like to talk to you, and Hulk said, give him my number. They gave Hulk my number, and I remember specifically, it was one of those moments, there's a couple moments in my wrestling career that I remember very vividly, and this is one of them. It was late at night. I was laying in bed with my wife, must have been about 11 o'clock, midnight or something, already had fallen asleep, and the phone rings in our bedroom, and I answered the phone, I was half asleep. I couldn't imagine who was calling me that late at night, because anybody that knows me knows, A, I don't like to talk on the phone to begin with, and B, after 6 or 7 o'clock at night, I really don't want to talk unless it's really important. So the phone rings at midnight, and my first thought is, oh God, it's an emergency. But anyway, pick up the phone, and Hulk has a pretty distinctive voice. And he said, hey brother, Hulk Hogan here. And it took me like 30 seconds to get my shit together, because I was sleeping. I was in a sound sleep. So I was kind of like in my mind stuttering and stammering and trying to buy some time to clear my head. And I finally came to. And we had a nice conversation, and basically ended up with something that sounded like, hey, come on down to Florida, let's have a conversation. If you're interested, I'm interested, let's talk.
How much do you tip your hand at that point? Is it you lay it all out, like you'll have carte blanche here,
No.
come on down? No. How much can you say on a first date like that?
I could have said anything I wanted to say, probably, but I didn't. It was more like, let's just feel each other out. I wanted to find out what he was interested in doing and what he was available to do. I'm a salesman, first and foremost, and I learned a long time ago that the best way to make a sale is to listen. So I listened as much as I could and let him talk, which helped me frame an offer that I could present to him.
What kinds of things is he saying?
At that point, he had worked a lot with WWE, had been on the road a lot, done the 300-day-a-year thing, 2 shots a day on weekends. He had done all that. Mm-hmm. His kids were really, really young. He really wanted to be home more, so schedule was a big deal to him. That was first and foremost. Got a pretty clear idea right off the bat what the money was going to end up looking like.
Was it a figure that was prohibitive?
No.
Even though you guys were underwater?
We were underwater, but we had started turning things around. Oh. By that time now, I had done enough things, and this is another part of our history that gets overlooked or buried in some cases as a result of the narrative that's been out there for so long. But when I took over the company, it was a $25 million a year company that was losing $10 million a year. By the time Hogan came on board, all of the things that I had been doing for the year and a half or 2 years preceding that were starting to make people at Turner Corporate go, maybe Ted was right. Maybe this can work. The Disney tapings, externally to the wrestling fans sitting at home or, on the dirt sheets or wherever, before the internet, they hated it. Wrestlers probably hated it. Corporate loved it because advertising loved it. That was working. The whole look and vibe and feel of the show was working corporately. There were corporate executives that now wanted to bring their families to Disney to see WCW because it's something that they owned. So the entire vibe started to change, and so did the economics. Our numbers started improving, and we were losing less and less and less. We were rapidly getting to that point where it looked like, in fact, in 1994, we were so close to making money. I think it was in 1994 that I bet the chief financial officer of Turner Broadcasting, and I bet him $1 that I was going to turn a profit in 1995. And a year later, I made him get on his hands and knees and hand me that dollar in front of the executive vice president of Turner Broadcasting. So we were close enough to the point where people started to believe in me that when the Hogan opportunity came to light, it was simply a conversation with Bill Shaw, who was my boss at the time, and Bill went to Ted, and Ted went, hell yeah, let's make it work.
How many conversations did it take with Terry to get him to that point where...
With me?
Yeah. He's talking to you exclusively, right? He's not talking to Ted or
No. Well, he probably
Flair?
talked to... No, he wouldn't have talked not to Flair about money. And I'm hesitating because I can't remember whether the chicken came before the egg or vice versa. But part of it all dovetailed. It wasn't just the money and then we had to figure out the creative. It wasn't the creative first, then we had to figure out the money. It was getting Hulk comfortable on the creative side of the equation and what his future was going to look like while we were figuring out the money. So it was kind of going on at the same time. But Rick had nothing to do with the business side of it. He had a lot to do and almost everything to do with the creative side of it. Rick and I went down, we met with Hulk probably 2, 3, 4 times over the course of a month and a half or 2 months, talking about what could be. And it may have started out as something as simple as, well, how about this guy or how about that guy? Hulk wanted to work with Rick. That was the best play for Hulk. So then it became, all right, what do we do with Hulk and Rick? How do we build that story? How do we tell that story? Once the creative issues were solved and we kind of had a pretty good blueprint of what we wanted to do, which was Hogan and Flair, the money side of the equation, that was really between Bill Shaw, myself to a degree, Bill Shaw primarily, and obviously Ted, because it was a lot of money. But it actually came together pretty quickly and relatively painlessly.
It's reported that the initial deal he agrees to is $300,000 per match for 3 pay-per-view shows and 3 clashes plus 25% of any increase in pay-per-view revenue above the recent WCW average, 25% of the house for a handful of house show dates in Europe and the United States, and 65% of all merchandising revenue for a period ending December 31st, 94. Ballpark? Sound like something?
The deal that I remember, you know, and maybe what I'm about to say is part of that, or part of the deal that you have information about. But what I remember is the nut was about $2 million a year. There were 4 pay-per-views involved in that. There were TVs that led up to each one of those pay-per-views that were included in that $2 million figure. And, you know, he may have gotten a big chunk of the licensing and merchandising off of his stuff, not off of everybody else's.
Gotcha. Creative control. It's a philosophy that's been bandied about a lot, but you said some very poignant stuff about it in your book about the creative control clause in Hogan's contract that I think was pretty telling, in that if you're working at the top anywhere, you kind of have creative control, don't you?
Sure.
Just the fact that you've put it in words.
Ask Stone Cold Steve
Right.
Austin, or ask The Rock.
You may appease me by putting it in print, but
Yeah.
how are you going to see me?
Yeah, talk to the Click back in the day. Ask Vince McMahon how many times he had to jump on a plane and fly to a house show to get people to do crap they didn't want to do. So, yeah, while we may have expressed it contractually in Hogan's contract, and by the way, I've heard and read a lot, especially recently, about how a lot of people had creative control, which is, I think it's fabrication. I'd like to see a contract that I signed that, other than Hogan, gave anybody creative control. I don't think it really existed.
There were
Could be
people
wrong.
claiming they had creative control
Oh, yeah.
under you.
Oh yeah, I've read that.
Okay. But does the fact that you've tacitly expressed it in a contract now start to flutter through the locker room and have others say, "Well, hey, didn't realize that was on the table"?
There was some resentment. There's no doubt about it. There was some resentment, especially with guys like Ric Flair and people of people that were higher up in the food chain. Yeah, there was resentment, no doubt about it.
The big parade at Disney, how does one go about pulling that off?
It's really pretty easy.
Did you just piggyback on the existing parade that happens every day and throw them on the floor?
You go to Disney and you tell them this is what we want to do, and it's Hulk Hogan, and they go, "Oh, Hulk Hogan! My gosh, the crowd at Disney would love that." And of course, you have to pay for it. And
Right.
You stage it, and you create a big parade.
Did you have to oversee that whole thing?
I didn't necessarily oversee it. There was other people working for me that did.
About this time, we start to see the WWF respond to the opening salvo with their new generation push. Is that on your radar at all, with the fact that they're kind of going to rebrand off of your signing Hogan as the place where the young athletic people work?
Yeah, I don't recall the timing of that. I wasn't, until Nitro happened, despite what everybody would like to believe, I really wasn't paying that close attention to WWE on a move-to-move basis or day-to-day basis.
Should you have been?
No, look, I held them up on a pedestal. I knew what they had accomplished in terms of syndication. I knew what their ad sales were doing. Obviously, their live event business was doing great. They had a licensing and merchandising model that I was envious of. So from a business model perspective, I was very aware of them and kind of held them up as a model. But from a creative point of view, no, I didn't.
Even though you're in direct competition, really?
I really
with
wasn't.
them?
No, I wasn't.
You don't think?
No. I didn't. Yes, I was, but I didn't look at it. I was in competition with myself at that point. I was in competition with controlling our budget. I was in competition with myself to change the perception of our business. I was in competition with the advertising world in the sense that I was trying to attract more dollars in that respect. I was in competition internally with corporate. There were still a lot of people at Turner that didn't want us to exist, and that was a major challenge for me. So between the political fight and all the other challenges that I had, that was enough for me. And worrying about how they were rebranding themselves or reacting to us signing Hogan wasn't really on my radar.
Is it difficult positioning him as a heel now because he came to be so iconic to the fans down there and was really beloved at this point, despite the fact that he worked as a heel for so long?
That was one of the biggest challenges that I had with Rick, not only as a performer, but as a person. You know, and again, this is coming from someone who's not a wrestler, so let's take everything I am about to say with a grain of salt. But being a heel gives you a lot of control over what happens out in the ring. And Rick was a guy that liked that control. He liked being a heel, even though the audience didn't want him to be one. It's conflict, as you just pointed out. So, yes, that was a challenge, and it was kind of the core of a lot of challenges that I had with Rick for a year or two subsequent to that date.
You felt it was necessary because of the Hogan thing?
He had to be a heel because of the Hogan thing, but Rick also had to be a heel because Rick is far more comfortable as a heel.
So Rick is part of these discussions with Hogan, all through trying to woo Hogan.
He led the discussions.
Right. So why resistance at this point from Rick? I mean, you knew this was the plan, right? You said it was the root of a lot of difficulty you had with him personally.
Post this.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Post this as we move forward a year or 2 years later, when it became apparent to me that no matter what we do, Rick could walk puppies to the ring, set them on fire, and stomp them out, and the crowd would go, woo! Yeah. That was the challenge that I had with Ric Flair. But for Hogan, yes, it worked. It worked.
Hogan makes an appearance here in the main event. He's involved all over the show in numerous segments, including a live interview in front of the crowd, where he's booed. Was that unexpected?
Yes.
Why was he booed, do you think?
Because it became apparent to me, and it probably should have been apparent to me much sooner than this. And I had a sense that there would be a portion of the audience that would not react to Hogan the way we wanted them to, because WCW is WCW and WWE is WWE. It's north and south. You know, it is what it is. And I underestimated the reaction from the hardcore NWA WCW audience that I inherited to a guy that represented mainstream.
Right. Did Hulk talk to you about this at all that night after? Is there any look, this isn't going the way we want, brother?
No, Hulk, he was a pro. I mean, he obviously felt it and reacted to it, as did I. But neither one of us overreacted to it.
Do you remember the wrong tape being played?
No.
Okay.
But you're going to remind me.
I'm going to remind you right now, and I guess it wasn't much of a...
Or it was a lot, and I put it out of my mind.
You might have blocked it through therapy. Nothing you can do when that happens, right?
Nope. I do remember it now. I remember hearing about it. Yeah.
Do you call a meeting? Do you get the...
Oh, I don't remember what I did. I'm sure it wasn't pretty.
Is this legit?
Yeah. Well...
Or was it going to be Flair and Sting all along?
Well, you know, it's a great thing about... And by the way, that was like the very beginning of, what was it, Cyber Tuesday, or what was the series
of
pay-per-view? Cyber Sunday or something,
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was the first really, truly interactive, let the fans vote wrestling experience that people were able to see on television. And the idea was really to drive the 900 line, because I was pimping us out.
Right.
I wanted to make money anywhere I could.
Sure.
So I thought, what if we tried this? And the idea was to put, stage people. You have the red locker room over here and the blue locker room over here. Well, of course, you want You put the people you want to choose, and you know who they're going to pick. You know who they want to see. And you kind of put them in front, and they get a little bit more animated and make a little bit more noise, and EVOD back here in the back. So, was it legit? Yes. But did we structure it and set it up in a way that we were pretty sure how it was going to turn out? Of course we did. But I was very proud of that, and it brings a smile to my face. I'm going to tell a story I've never told before. So that was my idea, right? And I'm excited about it. And I think I was doing play-by-play at the time. It was me and, I don't know who it was, maybe me and Shivani or me and somebody. I don't know who it was. Or maybe I was hosting the show, whatever I was doing. But it was live, right? And I got my teeth knocked out when I was a kid with a baseball bat. So everything from here to here was fake at the time. But this was before, they could just like screw stuff up into your jaw. Like now, I've been kicked by horses and my teeth are still in my head, so it's okay. But back then, not so much. So I had this little flipper plate, temporary plate. You have to take it out and clean it every night, not to get too personal, but it was kind of a temporary thing. But it stayed up there. Nobody knew. But as I'm articulating and I'm talking to the camera and I'm saying, tonight, as I said, tonight, my tooth went flying out. This is live television. My tooth goes flying, the portion of it goes flying out of my head. And I'm right-handed, but in slow motion to this day, I can see myself going, and I'm reaching out. I grabbed that tooth and I got it back in my mouth and situated in my mouth, and nobody knew it but me. Wow. That was my biggest accomplishment.
And the world is going to YouTube this promo to try and find that. That's
fantastic.
All right. As he left the courthouse before stepping into an airport taxi, he points to the news cameras and says, do you remember?
No.
Better watch the pay-per-view this Sunday, brother.
I love him.
Coming out of McMahon's trial.
How do you not love a guy like that?
That's some loyalty, boy.
Well, no, that's a pro. He knew the world was watching. He knew that was going to get, played all over the country. He knew it was going to get hype, and it's probably more hype than we could have gotten for all the money that we were able to scrape together to buy. I don't remember, but it makes me laugh. I want to call him and thank him when this is over.
You can do that on air.
Thank you, Hulk. Amazing.
No, on the phone.
Instinct.
Other than his testimony, does the trial have any ancillary effect on wrestling or WCW or?
No, because we knew it was going to happen when we went into the deal with Hulk. It's not like it was a surprise. Mm-hmm. So everybody internally was prepared for it. It was a speed bump.
First and foremost, and most importantly, why wasn't there a Great American Bash this year? That's such a joke.
I don't know.
It's rooted in the Southern culture, the Great American Bash Tour. Now, how is Rick with all this up to this point?
Great.
Yeah.
He was excited. Rick is such a performer. Rick, and I haven't talked to Rick in 6 months or a year, and he's not really wrestling anymore, so it's probably different for him now. But in those days, and even as recently as up to 4 or 5 years ago, Rick, like Hulk, and I'm still very, very close to Hulk, never happier in their adult lives than the time when they're in the ring performing. Right. Nothing makes them feel more whole and happier. So Rick being in that position with Hulk and the attention, the promotion, the storytelling, bringing in Shaquille O'Neal, I don't think he could have been happier.
This match is extremely successful on all counts. Yet, just a few years prior, they were both in the WWE. They were both fighting each other. What did you capitalize on that Vince couldn't when he had both of them?
I don't know. Well, because I wasn't there in WWE when it occurred. And I don't know. It didn't seem to me, looking back at it, even then, as I look back at what had happened in WWFE at that time, it didn't seem like Vince really committed to it. It was kind of like, let's put it out there and see how it feels, but he wasn't committed to it. He dangled it out there, and then he just
Like, why wasn't this a pay-per-view main event the first time these guys touched over there?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Vince.
One of the more glaring lost opportunities, I think, and there aren't many with Vince McMahon, but that's... Your company spends more money promoting this than I think any other in history. I mean, you've got the USA Today ad, right? They're on Regis and Kathy Lee, I think. Tonight Show. Can a comparison be drawn between this and kind of like the WrestleMania, the first WrestleMania that Vince banked on and put all his eggs in that one basket? Were you putting all the eggs in this basket?
No. This was really, again, it goes back to my original focus, which was to become more mainstream, to position WCW long-term as a place where advertisers would want to put their money. So, certainly having Hulk Hogan and Shaquille O'Neal and Ric Flair gave us the justification to take out a full page in the USA Today, because most of the world would know who's in that ad. It wasn't me hoping that, oh my gosh, I hope I get all this investment back on this pay-per-view. It was part of a long-term strategy. Okay. It made us more viable 2 years later than it did necessarily on that day.
What moment do you consider to be the official end of the NWA? When Crockett sells to Turner or the coronation of Hulk Hogan?
As a fan, I didn't know anything about NWA when I was living in Minnesota.
But what was the death knell for that?
It didn't exist.
Promotion rooted in the South and
when they sold it,
the shadow of Harley Race hanging over the ring.
When it sold, when we tried to transition away from all of that, and as every day I was trying to find a way to no longer be perceived as, and nothing against the NWA, it was a very successful organization as a regional territory at that time. As much as I love to this day Vern and Greg Gagne and their entire family for all the opportunities they gave me, I wouldn't have wanted to be a shadow of them either. Right. So for me, the NWA was over and done when Ted sold the company and it went bankrupt.
We had him on the show, and he talked about his balancing his image in Japan and doing what people in WCW wanted him to do, or not doing some things. And was this an issue for you with Vader and trying to protect other people, his image with other people?
Because I could give two shits what people in Japan thought of Vader when I was paying Vader $500,000 a year. That's just the way my brain works. If I work for you, I care what you think. I don't care what he thinks. Even though I may get a part-time gig with him every once in a while, if you're paying my bills, this is where my loyalties lie. It's where my commitment lies. And I never did then, nor could I probably now understand that balancing act where I've got to mitigate or compromise what's best for my company so that you can make a living over here.
How does a discussion with a talent like that go?
Not well. That was a big conflict, with not just Vader, but a couple different people. I had the same issues with the luchadors from Mexico. Right. It was great, if someone were to say, look, you don't have to pay me a full-time salary. Forget that $500,000 guarantee you're giving me and just give me $250 so I can pick up some money in Japan. Then I'll have that conversation with you. But don't ask for, a top contract and then ask me to treat you like a part-time employee. So that was an issue.
What would have helped Leon engender some loyalty from him? As Inoki did, massage girls into the room all night long. He enjoyed that.
I'm sure he did. Really?
I don't know. You're going to tell me.
First of all, everybody had to be fired by Federal Express.
It had to be
fired in writing.
Right.
So, to people to conveniently
via fax, we hear via. Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that someone like Ricky Steamboat or Steve Austin, which is the one I'm most famous for,
Right.
didn't deserve a conversation and more elegant and respectful treatment.
Did they not get a conversation with the Federal Express?
Well, Steve didn't. He just got Federal Express. I don't recall. The only I tried to call Ricky a few times. I got his wife. Didn't go well. So I kind of let it go with that and just did what I had to do.
Was Bonnie his official agent ever, or
Who? Bob Eaton?
Bonnie?
Bonnie? Well, if she wasn't, she should have been, because she sure acted like it.
Was the original plan to go with him long term prior to the injury?
No.
Okay, because his contract, I think, was going to be up at the end of the year. Is Steamboat someone who would have been around?
Yeah.
Okay.
Phenomenal talent.
Had he not injured his back? Okay.
First of all, it's father-son. It's heartwarming. People want to see it. People can relate to it. And Dusty's Dusty Rhodes. And Dusty could get in the ring today and probably have a match that could blow the roof off in WWE. Now, granted, you probably only have one, and you only want to see it once a year or so.
Once, yeah.
But to this day, if Dusty were to get in the ring and get involved in some physicality, whether it's an official match or just being in the ring, I guarantee you'd get a great reaction.
How is Dusty with taking direction from Rick?
Nah, not so good. There was a lot of, it's over now. You know, they get along now, I'm sure. But there were many conversations that I had with Dusty Rhodes before Ric Flair came back to WCW about Ric Flair and how they would never work together again and all the evil things that Ric Flair did. And then I'd heard from Ric Flair about all the evil things that Dusty Rhodes did. And, you know, there's probably a little bit of truth on both sides of that equation, but the heat between the two of them was very real. In their minds, it was, you know, very real. So it was tough.
When you see that with two high-profile talent, well, let's take specifically them. When you see that with those two, are they at least professional?
To each other in front
in the
of
locker
others,
room?
yes.
Okay.
It's the conversations you have separately,
That's what I mean,
privately,
right.
that become intense. and
But
hard to
backstage
manage.
at the pay-per-view, I, as another worker on the card, would not be privy to one saying, "Fuck
unless you
off
were
to the
close, real close to either one of them.
other." And they confided in me privately. Okay. Apparently, you two were about 50,000 apart on the price tag. And
No,
he
we
doesn't-
weren't. He just didn't want to do the finish.
That was it, just the finish?
He just didn't want to do the finish. He wasn't demanding more money, nor was I negotiating for him. For God's sake. Look, as much as I love Hulk, and to this day he's one of my best friends, if not my best friend. With Hulk, there's a reason. This morning I got up and I looked at some pictures from the Hulk Hogan Fan Appreciation Day at Madison Square Garden.
Yeah.
It's NWO, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Six-Pack's there, I think. You know, Hunter's there. Big group shot, and so is Jimmy Hart. There are certain people in Hulk's life that where Hulk goes, they go. Mm-hmm. And when Hulk came to WCW, that group of people that came with him was obviously bigger than it is today. But Honky Tonk was one of those guys. Hulk really wanted him. He believed in him. He didn't want him because he wanted to do Honky Tonk a favor. It wasn't that. It was because in Hulk's mind, he was like coaches do and directors and producers often do. They go to what they know.
Sure.
They go to what's worked in the past. Even if they're going to try to change it up a little bit and make it feel new, they go to that thing that they know. And that's what Hulk did with Honky Tonk. And in Hulk's mind, back then, 20 some odd years ago, yeah, I know, we did it before, but if we do it again, people will still love it. His judgment was wrong. It wasn't correct. I went along with it. It was bad judgment on my part as well. But I promise you there was no negotiation over money involved.
No
I
long
brought him
protracted
in
process to get him to
against my
sign.
will. I agreed to the program, hoping I was wrong about him. And when he didn't want to do the finish, I showed him where the door was. And it was one of the happier days of my life.
You didn't do it by FedEx? You did that one in person?
No, I did
it
that
sounds
one just like this.
Right.
Hit the fucking bricks, dude.
Is that about how it
That
went?
was exactly how it went.
Wright was always a guy that had such potential, you hear from everybody. Why doesn't it cross over? Why doesn't it go further?
First, I think it could have over time. You can't get somebody over, I don't care who you are. Vince McMahon can't get as much of an artist as he is and a master as he is at getting people over, and as much of a machine as he has to help get people over, and the depth of talent that he has for someone to get over with. He can't do it overnight, clearly. We're seeing that now.
Yeah.
And Alex was green. He was a young kid. And on top of that, he was German. American, how long has it taken for soccer to get over in the United States? Americans like American stuff. It's a flaw, but it is what it is, especially in the world of entertainment. And at that time, it was even more pronounced. So someone who isn't American, who speaks with an accent, to come over here and get over had more work to do than the average guy. And the average guy, it took 5 to 10 years to get over. It was just premature. But he had all the skill sets. He was a great-looking guy. He had great athleticism. He had a good head on his shoulders. He was easy to work with, but he just didn't have the time. I made up my mind at a Disney taping that it was time to move on from Jesse.
Was this the taping where he fell asleep?
This was a taping where we had an entire production crew that I was paying for, a fair amount of money for, a sound stage that I was paying for, an entire roster of talent that we had flown in, a production facility, the sound stage that I was paying for by the hour, and we were ready to shoot a show. We had a tight schedule. They had loaded audience in. All of these things are happening, and we're ready to shoot a show, and we can't find our color guy. So we literally had to shut down the show and go looking for him. And when I found him was in an adjacent soundstage that was not in use, in a green room that wasn't in use, and he was curled up in a fetal position taking a nap. And he looked like he had a rough couple 3 days. And Jesse wasn't a drinker or a partier, and I don't mean to imply that, but he just looked beat to death. And it's a work ethic thing for me. If you're paying, and he was making a lot of money, and it's disrespectful. Forget about me. He could disrespect me all he wanted to. But when you put everybody else that was standing there waiting and jeopardizing their jobs and making them feel like they weren't important and making people sit in a crowd that came in, and I couldn't take it. So I made the decision.
You confront him there while he's asleep?
No, I didn't even care. No, I got him out to do the show, but I made up my mind at that point.
Right.
That's it. I'm done.
What's the discussion like? Is there a protest from him, or is he
I don't remember
done at that point?
I honestly don't remember, because I probably handed it off to attorneys at that point.
It wouldn't have had anything to do with the arrival of Hogan, who there was some resentment.
There was resentment on Jesse's part, not on Hulk's part.
No, on Jesse's, I mean.
Jesse chewed my ear off, and it was in that, thank you for bringing that up, because the falling asleep or taking a nap on the company's dime while we were looking for him, that was kind of the last straw. There was a whole lot of pissing and moaning and bitching, and Hulk did this and stabbed me in the back, and I wanted to unionize, and Hulk went to Vince, and blah, 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 blah. And whether it's true or isn't true, it had nothing to do with me. No. It wasn't my life. It wasn't my company. There was nothing I could do to change anything that happened in the past. I was just concerned about where we went with the future. We made a commitment to Hulk. Ted Turner made a commitment to Hulk Hogan, like a big one, $2 million worth of one. And it wasn't Jesse's place to undermine that decision. Jesse's job, like all of our jobs, were to do our best to make it work, not to pick it apart and try to undermine it. So it culminated with a nap. Jim was and is another one of those characters that can walk out and people know him and people respond to him, and he can get a great reaction from a crowd. Can he go in and have a great match? No. I'm not sure he was ever capable of having great matches as far as a technical match is concerned. But as far as getting an audience behind him and creating emotion and sucking him into the story as a character, he's one of the best.
He pins Austin in about 40 seconds.
That might have been a mistake in retrospect.
Is this something Steve would have objected to that night?
You know, I actually know Steve better now than I did then. I can't imagine that he didn't, but I don't remember that he did.
And then
He might have objected to somebody else other than me.
did you guys have a personal problem prior to the firing? Which
Steve and I?
happens a year after this, I think.
Steve and I?
Yeah.
No.
No. Never had a problem while you two worked together.
No. I mean, I didn't with Steve, interact with Steve a lot. When I was a talent, before I even got into management, I hung out in the green room with Steve when we were doing promos, and I did promos with Steve, and, you know, we got along casually just fine. I was kind of like a backup to the backup to the backup of a backup announcer, so I didn't really mean a whole lot in his world. But he was nonetheless very friendly to me, and we joked around occasionally, interfaced. Once things changed and I got more control, Steve, I interacted with him less as a result of that, because I was no longer a peer. Not that I was a peer necessarily, but I wasn't a talent. I was management, so that I interacted with him less. Occasionally, he would come to me with an idea as things progressed and I got more involved in the creative. He would come to me with an idea or two, but it wasn't until shortly thereafter that, you know, he left. I do recall that he was frustrated. You know, he was frustrated with WCW. He was frustrated with the fact that we were trying to put him in a box. And I think, I don't want to speak for Mick, 'cause I'm friends with Mick now. Some of the stuff I say jokingly about people, because it's part of the character that I still carry around with me and people expect. But I respect Mick a lot. And I did then, but we had diverse goals then, or opposite goals. And Mick wanted to be more extreme. He wanted to just, you know, be the pioneer of that, and I didn't. And WCW didn't. We didn't want the liability associated with it. So that frustration kind of built over time. I liked Ole. And to this day, I would, you know, it'll never happen, love to sit down and have a beer with Ole. Because he's the kind of guy that I like on a personal level and that I would hang out with on a personal level. But professionally, he was so narrow-minded and so focused and unwilling to adapt to anything. And he became very frustrated as a result of that. You know, I remember when he was in WCW, he's like, oh, he doesn't need any money. He saved all his money. Cool. I need the money. I do. To this day, I need the money. I'm not too proud to say it. And certainly then I needed the money. So I was kind of, when someone would say, you know, when I hear somebody, they're just doing this because they love it, they don't really need the money, I would kind of admire that in some respects. But at the same time, when you don't need the money, you don't need to learn anything either. And Ole was the kind of guy that just, he wanted to go back to 1975. Everything he did, no matter what it was, he wanted to go back to 1975. And, you know, you'd kick and scream and claw and punch and drag you through the gutter, and you'd finally go, all right, damn it, all right. And then he'd go right back to doing it the next day. Mm-hmm. So whatever the situation was that, you know, culminated his being terminated, and that could indeed be it, I don't recall it. But I just got to the point with Ole where I couldn't take it anymore. You know, the funniest Ole story I can remember, and this, you know, and Ole and I started, we'd be in a control room. And I used to wrestle in high school and college. And we'd get in a control room, and I'd get a wrestling hold, and he'd get a wrestling hold, and we'd be fucking around with each other. You know, we had that kind of a fun relationship oftentimes. But as time went on, it got to the point where he couldn't stand looking at me, and I kind of felt the same way. And I moved him down to the power plant, kind of took him out of creative. I literally wanted to get him out of the CNN Center because he was that much of a relic. And I was afraid something Bill Watts-ish could happen. So I just said, you know what, I'm just going to get him out of here. And get him down to the training center because he loved training. He was great at it. He was great at it because he understood psychology. He had that ground and pound, basic meat and potatoes kind of fundamental strength that I love to this day in wrestling. And it was a passion. And when I watched him do it, I went, okay, that's where he should be. For a guy that doesn't need the money, this is what he really enjoys. He doesn't enjoy being in the CNN towers, being surrounded by a bunch of suits. This he loves. So I moved him down there.
Yeah.
And then I also hired Blackjack Mulligan because he was in trouble and he needed a little help. And I could hire him at the time, and I was told he'd be a great agent. And a bunch of people endorsed him, and he needed a hand up. So I gave him a hand up, gave him a job as an agent. Blackjack was, I'm assuming still is, a very, very loyal person, like really loyal. And he had a fist about this big. And Ole found out how loyal he was and how big his fist was one day down at the power plant when Ole was bitching about what a piece of shit Eric Bischoff is, and how Eric Bischoff screwed him with this, and Twilight, Tweety Birds, and Stars later, he found himself on the floor because Blackjack just walked up to him in front of everybody and knocked him down. I think he knocked him out. I know he dropped him. And it was about that time I said, okay, this is escalating now to a point where it doesn't work anymore for anybody. So.
How'd the decision to retire him come about?
With much difficulty.
Yeah.
Because Rick was uncomfortable with being positioned as someone who is facing retirement in any way, shape, or form, whether it was creative and all part of a storyline or not. Personally, one half of his brain understood the story, and in one moment he would be supportive, or at least appear to be supportive of it, and then he would go home and think about it and not be. So it was a constant battle. It was a challenge.
So you understood it from, if Ric Flair was booking Ric Flair, he would probably maybe make that call, but he just couldn't take himself out of the ring.
But it's hard, and I understand it now. I didn't understand it then, because to me, it's storytelling. Mm-hmm. To me, it's just, if I'm writing a movie and I'm in a Western, and at the end of the movie I get shot, okay, I'm in the movie. I'm getting paid, and I'm going to do another movie when this one's over. But when you're the talent, and the lines between what's real and what's not real are intentionally blurred as much as they are, or as much as they were, I should say, in this business, in that business, it becomes much more difficult when you're the talent, especially when you're the talent that's knocking on 50's door.
But was it so much an objection to Hogan being the one doing it? No.
I don't think so. You'd have to ask Rick.
Right.
I just think it was the concept of being positioned to retire. His contract was his contract was, if not close to coming up, he wanted to make sure that he didn't position himself as being forced into retirement without a net. And that was part of it too.
Right. He does come back the following year as a manager. The Three Faces of Fear was formed here with John Tenta, Brutus Beefcake.
This one's happening on camera. This one hurts so much. I've got to have a drink. I don't even care.
A Sullivan, no doubt, right? This is a...
You think?
You think? Did they serve their purpose there at least?
No.
Are you vetoing stuff, or like what's the process? I know there's a committee, and are you a guy that's got a well, all right, try it, we'll see what happens kind of attitude?
Yes and no.
Or are you more stringent as an editor before it goes out?
Not at that time.
Okay.
Certainly not at that time. and probably not at that level. And even today, honestly, if I was, it's hard for me to think about this in this context, but I'm guessing that today, even though I know so much more, I think I do anyway, I've had a lot more experience now, obviously, than I did at that time, especially. I would probably be inclined to experiment in the middle of the show and in the middle of the card and let people try things that I personally may not really like.
Right.
Because I'm also smart enough to know that I'm not smart enough to know everything. And just because I don't like it doesn't mean other people won't. So I tend, even to this day, to be accepting and willing to try things that I may not necessarily like personally at a certain level. But at an upper level, I'm probably much more of a micromanager now than I would have ever been. Way more than I would have been back then.
Yeah.
I knew, and part of it was being a part of the Turner corporate environment, because international was, still is, you know, Ted's thing. And Ted liked, and I'm not saying I did it for Ted, I didn't, but opening my eyes up to the Japanese world of wrestling, the Hispanic world of wrestling, AAA Mexico, was something that made sense to me at that time. So
Maybe a demographic play to pull some Latino eyes onto your product?
just to put my toe in the water, to learn more about the audience, to learn more about AAA, to start a process where we could possibly expand into that marketplace.
This also marks the first appearance of Mike Tenay. What did you think of him from the get-go?
I liked Mike, and still to this day have a lot of respect for Mike's just sheer knowledge of the history of the business. I was excited. You know, Zane Bresloff is the one that brought Mike Tenay to my attention. Liked Mike a lot. Was excited to utilize him because I thought he could bring a color and a detail and a history and a relationship to the product to the audience in a way that nobody else on our staff could.
You're gonna have another drink there, aren't you?
Brother, you're killing me, brother.
I will give you the floor here to defend Ed Leslie as a Starrcade main event challenger for the World Heavyweight title.
Anybody that's not willing to accept the fact that they've made bad choices has never been in the business of making good ones.
But I'm going
made
to
a
rush
bad
to your
one.
defense here as I prompted you there. Friend of Hogan.
No excuse.
I don't know about that. For a lot of guys, no excuse. For Hogan to say...
No, for Hogan, it's fine.
No, for you...
For me, it was a mistake.
Even for Hogan.
Yeah.
To do that for Hogan.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because that was more than helping Ed out. That was more than giving Ed a job. That was
Okay.
that was putting other people at risk. That was my bad. I think Hulk believed in him, you know, because he was close and he had a different point of view than I did. So I don't think Hulk was doing it knowing that it was a bad idea. I don't believe that. But I knew it was a bad idea, and I went along with it anyway. And that was my mistake.
Does your committee know it's a bad idea?
Everybody knew it was a bad idea.
But nobody said no to
No.
Okay. Jimmy Hart. What do you think of his role as the manager, hype man for Hogan? Necessary at the time?
No. Nope.
Probably didn't take a big chunk out of your payroll, though, right?
Nope. And he was, and still is to this day, he's still performing the same role that he performed for me, except for that when he was working for me, he was on camera more often. He can get Hulk from A to B. He can get Hulk where Hulk needs to be. Hulk is very comfortable and he trusts Jimmy.
Off camera, you mean?
Off camera.
The logistics.
So, yeah.
Ah.
and Jimmy is still in that role, is as active today as he was back then. But in this case, we were still, again, this is 1994, it's 21 years ago. So Jimmy was not that far removed at that time from having a viable role on television. So it was understandable how at that time Hulk believed that, people still know who he is, and they did. People still reacted to Jimmy. It's just where we were going and what we needed. To me, Jimmy diminished Hulk. He took away from Hulk. He didn't add, he took away. But there was nothing I could do about that.
But do you eventually have that discussion with Hulk?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've had that discussion many times. And as time went on, and then we went to NWO, and I clearly separated Jimmy from Hulk on camera, at least. But yeah, we had that conversation.
So, even though the houses may be down, how are you doing with ad revenues from TV, cleaning up the expenses? Where are we as we near the end of the year from a corporate standpoint, from a financial standpoint?
We're doing very well. Pay-per-view numbers were up. Ratings were starting to move in the right direction. We started to control costs a lot more. So things were moving. I don't remember where they were financially, but I do know that they were moving in the right direction.
So is it safe to say that you're starting to see, as early as '94, that this new era in wrestling may be not dependent on house shows at all?
No.
TV's where it's all at?
No, I never believed that. I did do some pretty controversial things along the way. For example, and it was probably in 1994, late 93, early 94, where I basically put a moratorium on all house shows. It's one of the things that led to me really becoming the president of the company, because Bob Dew and I had a different opinion about house shows, and a gentleman by the name of Don Sandifer. We were looking at our financials, and when you break down financials and you look at costs line by line, and we looked at the live event portion of our projections and our model and our history, and we were losing money every time we went out the door. Every time we went out the door, we lost 10 grand, 20 grand, 50 grand, whatever the number was, we were losing. So when it came time to say, okay, we've got to stop this, we've got to cut costs over here, we've got to fix the travel problem over here, we've got to find a better way, a more efficient way to produce our syndicated television shows by going to Disney. We're making all these adjustments. When it came to the live event part of our business model, which was a big part of it, it was 25% of it, or should have been. We sat down and the approach was, well, we're going to do more house shows. Now, I am not a finance guy. I'm not. I've been married to the same woman for 32 years this summer, and I've never been allowed to have a checkbook, ever. I have 2 credit cards today in my wallet right now. I have an American Express and I have 1 Visa. That's all I get, because I don't keep track of stuff. But even given my limited financial expertise, I knew that the math behind, well, we lose money every time we do 1, so we're going to do 10. I knew that was fucked up. And I threw a flag on that. And I literally shut down, that's why we went to Disney, shut down all the house shows, shut down all the TV events in all the little markets where we weren't selling a ticket and giving shit away, and you had to travel people there and drive trucks up there and set up production. None of it made any financial sense. So to answer the beginning of your question, yes, we shut a lot of that stuff down. We were, even though we were still having struggles at the house show level in a lot of markets, we still weren't functional at that level. But we had contained costs, and the picture was starting to get a lot brighter in other markets.
Why do you think Vince let Savage go? I mean, he had to know that, based on the Hogan, maybe the Gene Okerlund, maybe the Bobby, he's basically handing them to you.
reticent to speak for Vince. I'm not going to speak for Vince McMahon. I couldn't. But what I've heard from various people who were kind of close to the epicenter of it all, Vince didn't really care. Vince didn't want to see Randy in the ring any longer. Vince was committed to going in a different direction as far as in-ring. Randy wasn't ready to walk away from his in-ring career. And Vince was kind of like, well, great, if you want to go, go. I don't think Vince was afraid of losing Randy at the time. I don't think Vince looked at us as much of a threat at that time. I think Vince realized or thought that if Randy wants to go and he can get a better paycheck and he's a happier person, God be with you, go.
Does it take much convincing to get him in?
No. He came to me. I didn't come to him.
How was it with the money?
One of the easiest deals I've ever done. It cost me $0. Because Randy came with Slim Jim, and the Slim Jim sponsorship covered most, if not all, of Randy's initial year, second year of his contract. So it was an easy deal to do, and it served my purpose as far as changing the perception of our company
National
with
sponsor,
advertisers and Madison Avenue.
What did he bring to WCW? Other than that, what did he bring?
Which was a lot.
Okay, interesting question opens here. As much a factor maybe as having Randy Savage there is what he can do with the Madison Avenue thing?
It was very important. I didn't think of it in terms of what's more important, having Randy or having Slim Jim. To me, it was a package, and the overall package was exciting. I didn't really understand the potential of Randy Savage as much then as I probably should have, and certainly did. I mean, Randy delivered a lot. Randy was a great acquisition.
How did Hulk feel about him?
Hulk was the one that brought him in.
Okay.
Hulk talked to Randy. Hulk talked to me. I said, sure, have Randy call me. Then Randy and I started speaking, and that's how it started.
Was the plan at this point to bring Elizabeth in as well when her no-compete was over?
Not initially. It wasn't a part of the conversation initially, but it became a...
They were divorced at this point,
Yeah.
right? And was he hesitant to work with her?
No. And again, I just, as a principal, I don't like to talk about people that can't correct me or refute what I'm saying if I'm wrong, because it's potential, me being wrong about stuff like this that happened 10 or 20 years ago. My impression was that Randy still loved her very much. Even though they were divorced, he still loved her very much, and he was still, at that time, he was still very protective over her. So he was excited to have her in because he wanted to help her, even though I think she was married or was engaged at the time. It wasn't a romantic thing.
Right.
It was almost brother-sister-ish. He was excited to have her because he believed in her as a character, but he was also extremely protective of her. Vader was a little unpredictable, somewhat unprofessional, and Hulk wasn't interested in being in the ring with anybody that wasn't 100% pro. And by pro, I mean at that level of professionalism that didn't put his own interests and goals ahead of the match.
From a physical standpoint?
Yeah.
Was it your plan to put the U.S. title on Vader to set up a series of Hogan-Vader matches?
I don't recall. That makes sense.
Right.
Because it makes sense, I'd like to claim credit for it, but I don't know that it's true.
Well, as 94 comes to a close, we see that Hogan and Bischoff deliver on their promise of increased ratings. Yes?
To a degree, yeah.
Pay-per-view buys. Revenue for the company.
Yep.
And you managed to expunge some of the costs. Will you forever be linked in your legacy, what you did for WCW to Hulk Hogan?
Sure. Fine with me. If you're going to be linked to somebody, you might as well be linked to somebody like Hulk Hogan.
And maybe vice versa as well. The one who got Hogan to be relevant in the 90s and beyond, maybe was Eric Bischoff.
I don't think people will think that way.
Really?
You know, I don't. I mean, I would like them to.
Well, fast
I
forward
guess.
to maybe to NWO then.
Yeah, but even that, look, people have short attention spans, especially when it comes to giving any kind of positive credit to anybody for anything, not just me, but anybody. It's a lot easier for people to go, oh, but he did that. Oh, he should have done that differently. Oh, he fucked that up. You know, that's human nature. Will people look at me as the guy who gave Hulk Hogan, you know, a second or third, you know, life in this career? I doubt it. He does, which is all that matters to me. I know it, which matters. I guess my wife and kids probably get it. At the end of the day, I really don't care. I mean, I do. It would be nice, but I don't think about it all that much, to be honest.
Well, where do you place 94 in the lineage? Your tenure with WCW?
This sounds, gosh, I don't want to minimize it, but I don't want to overblow it either. But to be really honest, I've never really thought about it till this interview. It was my 4-year Harvard degree. I learned a lot in that year. I had to. I was learning on the job. I hit the ground running. I was in a job that I really probably shouldn't have ever been in. I was qualified in many respects. I understood syndication. I understood television. I understood wrestling. I understood it. I understood all of it to a good degree, but I didn't understand any of it well enough as I probably should have. But I learned a lot in 94, which set me up for 95 when things really started to change. So I'm grateful for it, but it was a learning experience.
I need the selfish part of the interview. As a fan of Ted Turner, as a media maverick, tell me a great Ted Turner story.
You know, I've only got one. That others haven't, you know, heard about or read about. You know, he was Captain Outrageous, for crying out loud.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of great stuff about Ted. But the meeting I had with Ted, and this was in 95, so hopefully you'll have me back again and we'll cover 95. But the meeting I had with Ted, where, honest to God, and I cannot, and I never say that unless I mean it, honest to God, I went into that meeting and I had no intention, thought, premonition, or even a wild-ass dream about Nitro or going head-to-head with the WWE. It was the farthest thing from my freaking mind. All I wanted to do was make $1 so I could make the CFO get on his knees and give it to me.
When he called you up there, he didn't say what he was going to talk to you
No,
about?
I knew what we were there. I called the meeting. I called the meeting. I asked for the meeting. I was trying to do a deal with Star TV in China, which was owned, or is owned, by Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch and Ted Turner back in 1995 was oil and water. They hated each other, right? That deal that I wanted to do with Star TV would have put WCW into profit, in a reasonable profit, for the first time in the history of the company. I wanted to do that deal. I had negotiated the contract, I had the terms, I had the money set. All I had to do now was get approval.
Right.
But if it would have been any other deal, I wouldn't have had to get approval. I had a pretty big authority to do deals. I could cover a lot of ground. But that deal, I knew if I signed that deal, that it would put me in Ted's crosshairs because of Rupert Murdoch. So I enlisted Scott Sassa, who was at that time was Ted's. He was really the heir apparent to Turner Broadcasting at the time. Scott was like a superstar of superstars. He ran TNT and TBS. He ran all of the Turner Entertainment Networks. Scott was the guy underneath Ted. So I asked Harvey Schiller at the time. I said, could you please get me a meeting with Scott Sassa? Because I knew Scott, and Scott would support me. Because Scott was just numbers. Just numbers were numbers. I knew Scott would support me. So Harvey was my boss at the time. Bill had moved on. So I said, Harvey, could you get me a meeting with Scott Sassa and Ted? And I explained why, showed him the logic behind it. Because I really want to get this deal done. So Harvey said, sure. So at my request, Harvey Schiller, who's head of Turner Sports, went on to work with New York Yankees, George Steinbrenner, called the meeting, got the meeting set with Scott Sassa and Ted. And I walked into there with no intention at all other than to get Ted to agree to let me to do this deal with Rupert Murdoch's company. Maybe a minute into the meeting, after all the, take the niceties. Hi, Eric, how are you? Oh, yeah, I love that wrestling. You do a great house, Hulk. After, take all that, put that off to the side. It's all just bullshit. 1 minute or less into the actual reason while I was there, Ted interrupts me, and I won't do a Ted Turner impersonation because I suck at it, but basically he interrupts me. He says, Eric.
What I got to do to beat Vince?
And I used to box when I was right out of college. I boxed Golden Gloves for a couple of years. And the first thing they teach you, or one of the first things they teach you, is when you're getting your ass kicked and you're in the corner, tuck your chin and keep your hands up and look out over the tops of your knuckles. Look at your opponent. So I think, well, fuck, I don't know how to answer that question. So I'm just going to kind of, business-wise, tuck my chin and cover until I think of something. So I don't know what I said, and as my mind's racing, I'm thinking, okay, what does WWE have that we don't have? What can I say? Ted, the only way we're going to compete with them is if we have prime time. They're on Monday nights in prime time. We're on Saturday afternoons. 6 o'clock in the evening on the East Coast, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the West Coast. You can't compete with that. Scott, give Eric 2 hours every Monday night on TNT. Scott's jaw dropped because he didn't want to do that either. If he would have known, if he would have thought for a second that meeting would have manifested with me getting 2 hours on TNT, Scott would have never let the meeting happen. It just happened.
How long before the what now feeling wore off when you left the office? I mean,
Right as I was walking out the door. I walked out of the door. Harvey said, okay, great. Let me know when you got this figured out. Scott went the other way. He was like pissed off. And I even tried in my own way, because it was Ted Turner, for God's sake. I even tried, well, Brad Siegel was the head of TNT, and he wasn't there. He was out of town at the time, so he wasn't even in the meeting. It was either me or Scott Sassa. No, it was Scott Sassa. Sassa said, well, Ted, maybe we should have another meeting when Brad gets into town. Ted said, nah, Brad's a team player. He'll understand it. He'll be happy with it. Well, okay, well, that's it.
That's it.
If that's the reaction from Scott Sassa about maybe Brad wants to have a vote, and Ted shut that down like that fast, I thought, well, what the fuck am I going to say other than, yes, sir, I'm going to go figure this out. Which literally I did. I walked out. Ted's office was on the north side of the building. I was on the south side of the building. I walked across the bridge over to the south side of the building. I sat down and went, now what the fuck am I going to do?
Right. Well,
that was it.
Maybe we'll cover what he did do another time. Thank you very much.
All right, man.
For
It was a
agreeing
pleasure.
to do this.
I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you for watching.